mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. The DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing.
Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm going to be your host today, Mike Brasher, and we have another opportunity to visit with a graduate student out there across North America that's helping us conduct some important research affecting our waterfowl conservation, our waterfowl management. Today's guest is Maddie Lohman, a PhD student from the University of Nevada-Reno, and I had the great fortune of spending some time with Maddie earlier this summer up on the Yukon. Am I going to get this right? Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge, right there on the edge of the Bering Sea. Maddie is joining us remotely here. And so, Maddie, welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. It's great to catch up with you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
We're gonna get to a little bit of a discussion on our just unforgettable experience there on the YK Delta later on. But right now, I just want to visit a bit about who you are and how we met and when we first met, and get you to talk about some of kind of how you came to do research on waterfowl, because you're like many of the students that it seems like we have out there now. You are incredibly smart. You are highly quantitatively inclined. You describe yourself as a quantitative ecologist, not necessarily a duck biologist, but you're a quantitative ecologist that's doing duck research. And so in my eyes and mind, you're a duck researcher. I hope you're okay with that.
Oh, definitely.
But I want to talk a little bit about that. So in terms of your background, I will say the first time that I met you, you were one of the most impressive undergraduates that I'd ever come across, and that was at the North American Duck Symposium in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Was that 2019?
I think so, yeah. It was the summer right before I started grad school. So I think, 2019.
Yeah, I think it was that. Yeah, it was right before the whole global pandemic and all that kind of stuff. And so you were an undergraduate that was delivering a plenary, one of the introductory presentations in front of all the participants, all the attendees, and you just knocked it completely out of the park, so much so that I came up to you afterwards, had to find you and just compliment you on the wonderful job that you did. How did you get roped into that?
Oh, geez. Well, thank you so much for being so nice about it. I was shaking in my shoes. I was so scared. I got roped into it from a former and current mentor of mine, Thomas Rickey, who put together the plenary session. He knew I was very interested in especially spatial ecology, looking at things like how do populations vary across really broad landscapes. And he was putting together this plenary about changing demographic rates and how harvest kind of factors into that. And he felt like it'd be a really good start to my graduate career to come up and do that. I was not told what a plenary was.
And he certainly didn't explain that to you at the time, right?
Oh, no. And we practiced for weeks and weeks and weeks, but I never caught on this was more than just a conference talk. But yeah, just a mentor wrote me in, and it was kind of the research that would start off my graduate research. So it was really exciting.
That's awesome, and I'm glad Thomas did that. Thomas was actually there with us on the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge, and it was great to spend some time with him as well. And that's when I learned that all this time I had been mispronouncing his last name, Thomas Rickey, and he said as in Ricky Bobby, and so I can remember that. And so hopefully everybody listening to this now, if they're in the scientific profession, the waterfowl profession, it's Thomas Rickey. For whatever reason, I was calling him Ricky. So he said he gets that a lot, but that's okay. But I do want to kind of talk about your your path, I guess, to your PhD, which is studying waterfowl population dynamics, kind of for lack of a more specific description. I will say that the title in the proposal that you shared with me is Spatiotemporal Variation in Dabbling Duck Demographic Rates Across the Prairie Pothole Region. We're going to try to simplify some of that language as we go through this, but how did you, so you're a PhD student currently at the University of Nevada-Reno. So tell us about your path to becoming wanting to become a quantitative ecologist as you were growing up, and now you are one, and you're studying duck ecology with some pretty massive data sets. What did that path look like to you, and what intrigued you? I mean, why quantitative ecology?
Yeah, that's actually a question I get a lot, and it's always very interesting to answer because it's completely not what anyone throughout my childhood education would have expected from me, actually. I'm dyslexic. I struggle with numbers, mixing them up. Things like fractions are very difficult. I mix up my numerator, denominator, things like that. And so I actually was very scared of math, including statistics, for most of my life until Dr. Thomas Rickey, who I just mentioned, actually, I started working for him and we started working on research. And I was shown how especially quantitative ecology really incorporates these kind of two things I really enjoy, which is wildlife and ecology and that puzzle of the natural world, but also this puzzle of seeking patterns and seeking to, I guess, not generalize what's going on, but provide broader descriptors of things like a population, right? We're not describing every individual, but these broader trends. And so just working with him and going through this research, I just really fell in love with this kind of, I guess, puzzle that is quantitative ecology. And especially with waterfowl biology, like, geez, no one would have expected that. Like, I grew up in the middle of Las Vegas. I really like snakes and like desert tortoises and rattlesnakes. That's what got me into wildlife. But I needed a job my sophomore year of undergrad. I emailed around, and Dr. Jim Settinger, who runs the Black Brant Project on the YK Delta, or ran it, let me enter some data. I thought it was a temporary position, and then I stayed in that lab for 2 years and started a PhD.
Yeah, those professors are pretty good about identifying folks that have skill sets that are going to be useful to this profession. I mean, they've kind of made their living identifying high quality candidates, high quality students, and you're obviously one of those. And I'm glad they made that connection. I'm glad that they brought you into the field of waterfowl research. So you said tortoises and snakes in Las Vegas and the desert of Nevada. Was there sort of a mentor, a family connection, or somebody that helped you make that connection, appreciation for the outdoors?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My parents, it was just a really big thing. We'd skip church on Sunday most of the time and just go hiking.
Yeah, your church was the out of doors.
Exactly. And my mom especially really emphasized that to me growing up. This is a spiritual experience. We are look at all of this that exists. Let's look under a rock and oh my gosh, how much is just under one rock? But yeah, just constantly being outside with my parents, my sister, it really made me fall in love with being outside and just wanting to know what's out there and how does it work and all fit together.
I'll take this opportunity to kind of ask you, as sort of a junior and senior undergraduate, did you know at that time that you wanted to go on to graduate school? Because I get that occasionally. People will ask what my career path was like. How did I know that I wanted to go on to graduate school? When did I know that? What was that like for you? Did you have your sights set on graduate school? And was there a particular taxonomic group that you thought you were going to work on before you were discovered by Dr. Settinger?
Sorry. How do I put this? I had been told very early on, especially in the ecology, wildlife fields, probably a good idea to get a graduate degree. So I think about my sophomore year, which is also incidentally when I started doing some actual research, I was pretty okay, this is what I need to do in order to continue doing research. This thing I really enjoy and love that just makes me happy to do it. So I don't think immediately I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, but pretty quickly I did. And I don't think I ever thought oh, there's a specific taxa or system I want to work on. I'm a big believer in take the most interesting opportunity that's available to you at the time. And it turned out ducks were absolutely the most interesting opportunity available when I graduated.
Yeah, well, there's a good reason for that. There is a ton of data collected for across large spatial scales, large sections of North America over very long time periods. And whenever you combine all of those different characteristics, you get a data set that is super rich for answering questions about why populations change or how they change and why they change and so forth. And that kind of is a bit of a transition, I guess, to talk about your research. One of the reasons we kind of identified you as a person we wanted to talk with, because there are lots of graduate students out there across North America, and we simply do not have enough spaces on our podcast episode schedule to accommodate all of the graduate students doing important work on waterfowl and wetland conservation. I wish we did, but we don't. But the reason that you kind of stand out as among that group of graduate students is because you are a multi-year recipient of the Ducks Unlimited Bonnie Castle Fellowship in Wetland and Waterfowl Biology. Ducks Unlimited Canada, Ducks Unlimited Incorporated here in the States, each year collaborate to hand out 8 research fellowships to graduate students conducting work on wetlands and waterfowl in various parts of North America. And you were the 2-time recipient of that. So we want to highlight your research. And so this is where I turn it over to you and ask you again, those rich data sets. As a quantitative ecologist, how exciting was that to learn about the massive scale and space and time at which all these data were collected?
Oh my gosh. When I found out about it, I nearly jumped out of my seat. It was just oh my gosh, look at all these questions we can answer, but also all these modeling techniques we could potentially apply and have the modeling techniques kind of work. Because just with a lot of statistical models not having a big enough sample size, even if all the math's correct, you might not really get an answer to your question just because small sample size, you probably have a lot of uncertainty around the estimates of whatever we call them parameters that we're trying to estimate. So for me, it's a survival rate or harvest mortality. And so just knowing that this intensely rich, multi-species, multi-year, just landscape, continental level scale of a data set existed was just insane. And the first thing I did was think of 1,000,001 questions that I have not gotten to yet.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's really cool is that some of the data that you use is provided by hunters, in terms of band recoveries, those types of things. The other thing is that these other data sets, like the population data from the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, the BPOP survey, it's in some cases known. That's a data set produced every year, and that is of great interest to waterfowl hunters. We at Ducks Unlimited make a big deal out of that, and it's going to be released in August of this year, and we're going to be publicizing it, and we're going to be covering it, and hunters look forward to that number. They look forward to an understanding or a description of habitat conditions, all of the things that excite waterfowl hunters sort of on the surface about these things, these pieces of data, are the exact same things that you go in depth with to answer some of these questions about what's happening with waterfowl populations, right? I mean, that's what connects us all.
Oh, absolutely. And I do really, you said it perfectly, Mike. Hunters contribute so much to these enormously rich, important data sets. So I always try and really shout out, this is one of the largest public science data sets in the world that exists. And it's so stinking cool.
Yeah. So many other avian ecologists are really jealous of the wealth of data that we have in waterfowl. And we can continue to be thankful for that we have access to it. Helped us learn a lot. The other thing that kind of stood out to me, I was recalling whenever we were in Alaska, we found, I don't remember, I guess it was a white front nest. You and Thomas and I were walking along the first day that we got there, and we encountered a white front, a nesting white front, and she got off the nest, and we went over and looked at the eggs, and two were brown or sort of brownish red, and the other was white, or maybe it was 2 in 1, one or the other kind of situation. But you started asking Thomas about why that is. And then he was providing the description. And I have a video of this, and I'll see if we're going to try to post some of this at some point. But I remember your mind almost immediately went to like trying to explain that. Like we could probably can we model the uncertainty in sort of the laying sequence of those? And so that was the moment that I realized, wow, Maddie is like, her mind is quantitatively wired.
I mean, what I'd say is I am fortunate enough to have received an immense statistical education at this point. But I mean, I think those are really interesting and important questions in terms of, okay, so we can maybe figure out something like laying order by looking at how much staining is on the egg. But it's nature, it's ecology. There's a lot of messiness that goes on, and it's just fascinating to try and figure out how correct are we about something, some assumption,
Yeah. And the other really neat thing about it is I guarantee you could take every waterfowl hunter in North America and plop them there on the tundra with us and show them that same thing we were observing, and they would be fascinated by it. They would say, oh my gosh, that is so cool. Now, they may not immediately go to trying to figure out how to model the uncertainty around our assignment of laying sequence, but just the ecology of these birds, what they go through, the migrations they make, and how we marvel at them. Waterfowl hunters just are just like us in being fascinated by what these birds are doing and the things that show up, and how we try to understand them. So I guess I'll move on here, Maddie, to talk a bit about your research. I described the title, I mentioned the title earlier, Spatiotemporal Variation in Dabbling Duck Demographic Rates Across the Prairie Pothole Region. So hopefully everybody in the audience will know what the Prairie Pothole Region is, but I'm going to ask you to kind of decipher that the first part of that. When you say spatiotemporal variation in demographic rates, translate all that for us. What's the basic question or set of questions that you're answering with your research?
Yeah, so demographic rates are things like, especially for dabbling ducks, things like survival or harvest mortality or reproductive rates. All I'm interested in is looking at how do those rates change across space and change across time in conjunction. So is one site in the northwest of the PPR doing a whole lot better than some site in the southeast? And do those sites change in the same way over years or differently? For instance, does that site in the northwest, maybe the survival increases over the years? It started maybe pretty high and it just kept getting higher. And then in the southeast, did that survival rate, maybe it started really high, but the trend is different. Maybe there's a slight decrease over time. And so it's questions like that. Just how does these rates vary across both space and time? And do they all do the same thing? Do they do different things? And why?
You and I have both sort of talked about the different scales at which we can ask these questions about why is there variation in some of these different vital rates, but why is that important for us from a management perspective? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for management, we can think, or at least I think one of the biggest helps in trying to understand variation is this kind of idea of forecasting, just predicting if we have a really bad year, there's no ponds on the landscape this year, what will our duck populations do next year? And how might that differ across this really big landscape? So it's important in that sense. It's also really important to know maybe our kind of, quote unquote, subpopulations of ducks, again, across a really broad landscape, do they react differently to environmental conditions when they change. So say we have a uniform across the landscape, ponds decrease, all the same amount. Do ducks in, say, one area do better than others? They produce, we could say, more babies than this other population, even though ponds decrease the same amount at both sites. So knowing that is really important for management and just having this kind of, I guess, more specific understanding of how the population works in this specific area. And to get at this kind of more pure ecology question, something I'm really interested in is concepts of life history, which is a big fancy ecology term. But, just to vaguely describe it, it's things like how long will a duck live? How many babies will it have? How often does it reproduce? Does it reproduce every year or every other year? Things like that. Even migratory behavior and habitat use can factor into life histories. And I'm really interested in it because it gives us a way to generalize certain things to species we might not have as much data for and just don't know as much about. And so I guess when looking at the spatiotemporal variation, we can also look at this variation for different species and say, okay, we know these two different species have different life histories. Can we predict out to species we have less data for, less knowledge about, and then manage those species better?
That's a great segue to a break because we're going to take a break here. And then when we come back, I want to ask you a little bit more about that. You're studying different species in your research. And then I think we'll close out the discussion about your research. And then we'll get to you and I reflecting on the experience we had on the YK Delta. So stay with us, everyone. We'll be right back.
Stay tuned to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, after these messages.
Welcome back, everyone. I am here with Maddie Lohman, a PhD student at the University of Nevada-Reno. We are discussing her research, studying duck ecology, broadly stated, specifically trying to help us figure out why duck populations, why their survival rates, their harvest rates sort of change, and whether they change at different rates across the landscape of the Prairie Pothole region. Now, Maddie, you were telling me about this idea of life history and how those life history traits, survival rates, age at first breeding, migratory strategies, those types of things can vary among species. And I know that you are studying different species in this research. So tell us about that and why those species.
Yeah. So I study blue-winged teal, mallards, and northern pintail. And in addition to I think they're very charismatic species. They're really helpful for my research because they form this kind of life history gradient of dabbling ducks. And what I mean by that is this kind of concept of we have faster and slower life histories. Blue-winged teal don't tend to live super long. They reproduce with a lot of eggs every single year until they die in general. And then we go over to, say, northern pintails, and they're surviving a little bit longer. They might not even breed every year, and they're producing fewer eggs than, say, a teal at every reproductive attempt. And then mallards fall somewhere in the middle. And while this gradient isn't maybe as dramatic as, say, a mouse versus an elephant in terms of this kind of fast to slow continuum, we are able within this kind of grouping of species, dabbling ducks, to look at this gradient and say, how does variation in demographic rates and responses to the environment differ between these species? And how might these species' different life histories play into that?
And that's important, as you were kind of talking about, in helping us figure out if there's one species or maybe several species that can serve as sort of a useful substitute or proxy for others, for ones for which we may not have a lot of data in some cases. We're trying to figure out how uniform the returns or the benefits of our management actions or conservation actions or harvest management might be across different species. Is that about right? Like from a relevant standpoint?
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, we can't collect a ton of data all the time on every different species. Some are harder than others. And yeah, it's not 100% perfect, but it allows us to manage these species without data a lot better and gauge whether it works or not so much better.
Yeah, Maddie, we've already talked about some of the key data sets that you're using. How about tell us where you are in this research, like in terms of completing your degree? How much longer do you have to go? Are there any preliminary I'm really bad about asking a lot of questions at once. So how far along are you and how much longer do you have?
I have completed 4 years of my PhD. I have 2 years left. I'm really fortunate to have received a few different fellowships to fund that. And I'm also working on a master's degree in statistics concurrently. So I'm really taking my time with completing the degree.
And in terms of the research, anything that has stood out? I don't want to ask you to reveal a whole lot of preliminary information, preliminary results, because as we've said on previous episodes, we kind of like to stay true to the peer review process and make sure the information that we're sharing at any specific level has gone through that proper vetting. But any interesting tidbits or things that you have found particularly, exciting so far?
So many things, but again, I'm trying to think of how to generalize this because peer review is very important to me. I'd say one really cool thing is that we do, for all these species, actually do find spatial variation, particularly in survival rates. And it's very interesting because I also break up each species into age and sex class. So adult males, adult females, and then juvenile males, juvenile females. And it's really interesting to see, especially how these spatial patterns differ for all these different age and sex classes. I'd also say there's a tremendous amount of variation in all the demographic rates I study across time, which is really interesting to see what periods are particularly good for these populations and where are they not doing as well. And then trying to compare, say, are males doing a lot better in this time period, but females are maybe struggling? And why is that? And that also kind of brings me to another interesting preliminary result I've been working on quite a bit lately, is that we find that males and females, kind of broadly, demographic rates kind of align in terms of they'll go up, around the same time, and then they'll decline around the same time. We do see differences in both space and time. How do I put it? The variation between males and females is not quite the same. It's not 1-to-1. And trying to understand why that is and what the ecological dynamics are to generate those patterns is really interesting.
Well, I look forward to seeing the rest of your research, the results of your research. And so continue on with that. We were super excited to have supported your research as a Ducks Unlimited fellow. We were honored to have you sort of represent our organization. So thank you for that.
Thank you, guys.
Oh yeah.
Shoot.
Oh yeah. Is that we're happy to have the opportunity to do that, and it's just one small way in which we can continue to contribute to waterfowl research and help support the next generation of waterfowl scientists. Sort of in that vein, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about our fun adventure in the Yukon Delta, because that was another one of these. It's a long-term research project up there, right out on the edge of the Bering Sea, on the shores of the Tautoko River. And you and I and others were there. It was part of a little research group there's like a core research team that had been there for 30 or 40 days before we got there. And we're going to try to get that like core research team together on a future episode. I was talking with one of the members of that team by text, I guess, a few weeks ago, and floated the idea. And it was Caroline Blommel, and she said, absolutely, would love to do that. So I guess the rest of that crew is still up there as of right now. This is late July. They're still there. It's a long-term black brant research site, and it was my first time to have ever been there. I think, Maddie, it was your first time to have kind of ever been out on a waterfowl research site, right? You had told me that you had done a lot of work in the desert in sort of drier environments, but in terms of sort of a wetland landscape, was that the first major experience of yours?
I'd say major one, yeah. I've definitely gone, duck banding and things like that, but not for as long as a period and not. I think very few sites can replicate how intense that those field conditions are. But yeah, it was my first big trip to go work with the geese and the waterfowl. It was very exciting.
And you and I and Thomas met one another at the Anchorage airport. And from there, we went to Bethel. And from Bethel, we went to Chivak. From Chivak, we took a 4-hour, well, actually, it was more like a 7 or 8 hour boat ride from Chivak out to the field site. And we almost got stuck one time. And it was, that was an experience in itself. There, it was a bit of anxiety getting there and having to, because we were the first ones to get the boat and fire up the motor. And I was shocked that the motor started as easily as it did, especially after we realized that the little dipstick had been pulled out and it was low on oil. And, those types of remote situations, remote field camps always bring with them an incredible amount of logistical challenges. And so there we were, the first ones to get to use the motor in a year. And I'll be honest, I was surprised that it started up as easily as it did, but it did. We eventually got there. I had a wonderful time. Share with the audience some of your favorite memories, some of the most remarkable observations, things you didn't expect, or just what was that like for you?
Oh my gosh.
Big question, I know.
Yeah, huge question. Just everything was absolutely remarkable. I guess just, that kind of coming in 7 hours on a river on a small boat to get to camp was 9 p.m., just exhausted. And then just this absolutely gorgeous and completely, to me at least, novel landscape that I've never seen anything like this coastal tundra. My God, it was just amazing and jaw-dropping how big these rivers are. I'm definitely from Nevada, the Truckie's pretty big to me. And then I see these rivers and it's oh my gosh, I've never seen a river this big. And then I guess just the diversity, especially of avian life right there, was just, I've never seen so many sandhill cranes in one place before. Just 15 hanging out all together. Just so cool. And then, I don't know, I'm trying to think of all the interesting memories, but there's so many.
Yeah, because you were up there, you and Thomas were there for 2 weeks, or was it closer to 3 weeks? I was there for about 8 days, I think.
I think it was just over 2 weeks we were at camp.
And I remember emailing Thomas afterwards, and he said his feet were still recovering several days after he had gotten back. I don't know. Did his feet get in pretty bad shape by the time things were over?
Not that he told me, but I imagine just wet feet all day, every day. That probably is a little bit rough.
Yeah.
Walking around in just waders and wader boots all day is also probably not, there's not a lot of arch support there.
Yeah, for sure. So what was the coolest bird for you? We saw everything from emperor geese to spectacled eiders, common eiders. Somebody saw a king eider. I don't know if you saw that, if you were part of that group. You saw the king eider?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, okay. So I have the answer then, probably,
Yeah,
right?
no, I was about to say the eiders were definitely yeah. Oh my gosh, I love eiders. They're just gorgeous. And then the king, oh my gosh.
Yes. All right, so outside of the king eider, what was your favorite bird species, or the most surprising, or the one that you remember most outside of the king?
Honestly, maybe it's a little bit of a silly answer, but the black brant, just because I had worked on the project remotely for a number of years, and then just being able to actually go there and go up and see them and work with them was just amazing. They also really are good parents and get very upset with you when you go near their nest. So the amount of just getting beat on the head and back with wings. That really reinforces that bird in my memory.
Did you have an opportunity to look at the photos and videos that I shared with y'all?
Yeah, they were amazing.
Yeah, and
You're
so,
a great photographer.
Well, so I don't know about that, but my point in saying that was that we're going to try to get those out on some of our social media platforms here in a little while. I don't know when this episode is going to air, but sometime this fall, we're going to try to get some of that footage out there and some of those photos for people. But they are just incredibly remarkable birds, and I would share that with you. That I was stunned at how approachable those birds were on the nest. I mean, that we have some video of the researchers having to kind of forcibly move the hens off the nest to get to the eggs and collect the measurements from the eggs, and just wonderful video demonstrating the parenting that you talked about. But that entire landscape, and I don't know, it's the birds that were nesting there. There's some differences from one bird to the next, but there's a large number of birds there that just didn't seem to mind being very close to you. I had a hen pintail nesting 15 feet from my tent in camp. I'd wake up in the morning and we'd have a pair of cackling geese walking through the camp. We had a hen long-tailed duck nesting 30 meters from a tent. We had, what were they, western sandpipers. We had dunlins. We had, of course, the Arctic terns. Can't forget about them, right?
I was about to mention, they attacked you every time you went to your tent, Mike.
Yeah, I know. We kind of had a thing as soon as I would head in that direction. Here he comes, or she, whichever, would get up off the nest, come right towards me, and it's just like, kind of made a game of it by the end of it, or made sort of a friendship of it, I guess I should say. But it is a wonderful landscape, was a wonderful experience for me. I know it was you as well. You actually, as I said, stuck around a little bit longer and were able to spend some more time with the goslings. Talk about that. How cool was that?
Oh my gosh. It's always fun to have like baby birds in hand, but like these goslings were just the cutest fluff balls. I would say though, the parents got more aggressive as it got closer to hatch. And then especially once they had goslings, they were very, rightfully so.
Yeah.
I'll put that out there, rightfully so, but very unhappy with me. So just trying to manage these goslings, trying to scramble out from under my clipboard I put on top of the nest while I have one in hand. Dad's coming from the air, mom's coming from the ground. At one point I had a tern come and peck my head at the same time. It was a phenomenal experience, but definitely I got good at managing multiple things.
That was full on attack mode. Yeah. And I guess just to provide some background to folks, what y'all were doing is web tagging the goslings at that point. And the thing that I will say, I would hope people understand this to be the case for any research that we talk about, if it's conducted, that is conducted by university, state, or federal researchers. It's all done under the guidance of approved research permits, animal care and use permits. And so this is not just a group of people willy-nilly going out there and playing around with duck nests or goose nests. There's a very rigorous sort of permitting and use and research review protocols that all of these things have to go through. And so you in particular, as you were talking about, were attaching web tags to the goslings as they hatched. And the hatching in geese is very synchronous. It happens much more so than ducks because of that compressed breeding season. How fast pace was that week? Because the day that I left, that Carolyn and I left, was the first hatched nest that was being monitored. But I imagine over the next 2, 3, 5 days, the number of nests that started hatching just exploded.
Oh yeah, it was a quick buildup. There were a lot of long hours pulled, a lot of miles walked, a lot of nests visited to just make sure, at the very least, we could say this nest is hatched and here's the date it hatched. If not, the primary goal being trying to get those web tags on goslings so we can, track them to, becoming juveniles and then banding them. But it was so quick and exhausting. We'll
talk more about that research if we get Jordan and Caroline and others on on an episode here later this fall. Just sort of a side question here, did the waders continue, the new waders that you were left with by Caroline when she had to leave, did they continue to perform as good for the rest of your time as it sounded like they were going to whenever you first tried those things on?
Oh, they did, absolutely. It was amazing. I was cruising across the colony. It was wonderful.
Yeah, it's kind of the backstory there is that you had a pair of waders that didn't fit you all that well.
No.
They were the molded boot. Ideally, in those kind of situations, you want the stocking foot waders with a good hiking boot or fishing boot or something to go over it so that your foot is not pulling out of the boot whenever you get stuck in the mud, because it is in some places some very deep, deltaic mud. Like we're talking up to the knee in some places. And if you had a couple of instances where you got stuck in the mud. Like I was telling you, anybody that spends enough time in the marsh is going to find themselves in that situation. But with as much walking as we all had to do, that became a huge pain for you. And then when you were able to finally try on those waders of Caroline's and they fit, I have video of that also. And that's one of my favorite videos of your reaction and your excitement. And so that was awesome. I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, it was perfect. It was, sorry, I cannot stop going on about it. It was amazing to have waders that fit me.
Yeah, that's very important. Very important takeaway. Well, let's see, anything else before we wrap up, anything else to share, like memory-wise from our trip to the Yukon Delta?
I'm trying to think. There's so many memories, but I think especially just sitting in the weather port with everyone,
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Everyone there is just so phenomenally intelligent and kind and just charismatic. And it was just so fun to, play cards and drink hot chocolate or talk about an extremely silly book or things like that with people who are just fun to talk with.
Yeah, I'll give a quick shout out by first name only because I don't have all their last names here with me. But Jordan, Caroline, Laura, Jacob, Lydia, and of course, Thomas was there as well. You were there. I got everybody, right?
Yep, I think so.
Okay. And so everybody except you and Thomas are the ones that we're going to try to get on a subsequent episode. Talk about some stories. They're going to have some. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. The sauna. There's a whole backstory on the sauna as well. We'll explain that in a subsequent episode. But did y'all make much progress in rebuilding the sauna before y'all left?
They were almost done, but I think I wasn't quite sure, but there was a plywood shortage by the time we left.
Yeah.
But it was very, very close. I think they probably have a sauna now.
Okay. Yeah, and so the story on I feel like I probably need to clarify that. The reason for a sauna is because there's no running water. There's no, no indoor toilet or anything of that nature. Folks are out there for, all summer without running water. They have to bring in their potable water, drinkable water by boat. And the sauna, my understanding, is sort of the closest thing to sort of a shower that folks can get, where you go into the sauna, you get all hot, and then you jump into the river and then kind of wash off there and then get back in the sauna and warm back up. That was my understanding of the protocol. And they had, for the longest time, had a sauna that they would construct or rebuild every summer. And that would be one of the little, quote, luxuries, if you can call it that, given the primitive nature of what that sauna was, that they would have. And because there was no shower. People were not able to shower there. And last year, the not a tropical storm, but a typhoon that came through in September washed away all the plywood and all the stuff that they used for that sauna in past years. So they were in a rebuilding mode. Did I get all that right?
I think so. That sounds correct.
We'll talk about that some more with the group. But anyway, that was another one of the things that you have to deal with in those remote locations. Maddie, I think that's probably. One last thing to do is to give you an opportunity to acknowledge your research partners and the folks that kind of make all this possible for you, and then we'll wrap up.
Oh, yeah. So, obviously Ducks Unlimited. And then I'm also fortunately extremely grateful to be a recipient of NSF's graduate research fellowship programs, fellowships that they give out. and those are my primary funders. But also, my advisor, Dr. Perry Williams, Dr. Paul Hurtado, Dr. Thomas Rickey, Dr. Jim Settinger. I'd be remiss to not mention them.
Yeah, and then I always like to say a thanks to everybody that has collected the data that you've used. I know you also echo that. We're talking about everybody from the Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state agency folks, provincial agency folks that contribute to those surveys, waterfowl hunters, waterfowl banders, anybody involved in those data sets. They always get a big shout out for their participation, for making all of this possible.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal effort, and the results are absolutely stunning. Yeah, thank you, Mike, for mentioning that. Yeah.
Maddie, it's been great having you on here. We appreciate, as I said before, you being a wonderful ambassador of Ducks Unlimited Science and of science for North American waterfowl. I thoroughly enjoyed getting to spend a week plus with you, and it was, I'm glad I had that opportunity. And we'll look forward to catching up with you, I guess, early next year.
Yeah, me as well.
Yeah, so thanks for being here with us.
Thank you.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Maddie Lohman, a PhD student at the University of Nevada-Reno, studying duck demographics and how they vary across that very important landscape of the Prairie Pothole region. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, who does a fantastic job with these episodes. And we thank you, the listener, for your time and support of the podcast. And we thank you for your commitment to wetlands, conservation, and waterfowl science.
Thank you for listening to the DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit ducks.org/DU Podcast. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks.